Alright, so in this video, we're going to be looking at inverse functions. So this is an idea that you would go over in a pre-calculus class, but it's also very useful in calculus. So in this video, we're going to be looking at just basically what it means in a very basic way. And in future videos, we'll be looking at more complicated examples. So let's say that I had the function f of x equals x 2x. So this is my original function, and I want to find the inverse of this. So what would the inverse be? So this is how I would write the inverse. This is not an exponent. This is just how you would notate the notation for the inverse. So what you would do is you just switch the x and the y values. So I'm going to rewrite this as y equals 2x, so I can swap the x and the y values to find the inverse of this function. So I'm going to make this x equals 2y. Just divide by 2 on both sides, making this y equals x over 2. So this is our inverse function. I'm just going to write that as using the inverse notation. So that's just x over 2. I also have the graph over here. So this is the original function, that is 2x, right? This is just 2x. And then here we have the inverse. So this is just x over 2. So one thing that I wanted to show in this graph, the reason why I graphed it, is to show that both of these lines are reflections of each other. So if I were to reflect this over the y equals x line, I would get to this. So that's one thing that is important, the relationship between an inverse function and the original function, is that it is a reflection. There are reflections over the y equals x line that goes through the center over here. So let me just jump over to Desmos to show this. So here we are at Desmos. So the purple line that you see over here, this is the y equals x line. And as you can see, it just goes through the center, and this is a reflection. The last thing I wanted to show, or to talk about, is the domain and the range. So the domain of the original function is the range of the inverse function, and the range of the original function is the domain of the inverse function. So they're just kind of swapped. The domain becomes the range becomes the domain. So here the domain and the range are both all real numbers, and you can see that on the graph. The x values go to negative infinity and positive infinity, and so do the y values, right? They stretch all the way. So the domain is all real numbers, and the range is also all real numbers. So this won't be very complicated. Here also the domain would be all real numbers, and the range would be all real numbers. And we don't need a graph to identify this, right? Obviously, since we wouldn't have any x values here that would cause any problems, so the domain is just all real numbers, and the range would also be all real numbers, and we can just identify what the domain and range would be based on this information. So this is just a basic example just to introduce the idea. In future videos, we'll be going over more complicated examples. So I hope you found this video helpful.